bound to a hitching post, rope cutting her wrists. Raw, this was the moment she stopped believing anyone would come, and then a stranger's voice broke the silence, 3 words that would save her life. Josie Calloway's shift clung to her back in a wet, dark stain, and the 5th crack was already climbing toward the sky when the crowd's held breath split open around the sound of a horse walking. Nobody in Kane's Hollow moved to help her. Nobody ever did. That was the whole design of a town like this one. Fear built the streets, greed paved them, and silence kept them standing. And on that particular afternoon, in that particular gold camp, it was about to run clean out. I've carried a lot of these frontier stories to you by now, and most of them teach the same hard lesson twice, that cruelty finds an audience faster than kindness ever does, and that a crowd will watch almost anything happen to somebody else's daughter before it'll risk its own skin to stop it. This is not that story, or rather, it starts that way and refuses to end that way, which is rarer than it should be. Stay with me through to the canyon camp at the end, because a debt that had been coming due for 12 years finally got paid in full on a muddy street in Montana Territory, and the man who collected it never once raised his voice above a murmur. Let me take you back a little further first, because you can't understand what release her meant, coming out of that particular mouth, unless you understand what it cost him to learn how to say it. Kane's Hollow, Montana Territory, 1881. Say the name to anyone who'd pass through and watch their face change. It had started, like most of these camps, as a scatter of tents along a creek where somebody found color in a pan, and within 18 months it had a main street, 2 saloons, a mercantile, a boarding house that did more business by the hour than the year, and a population that turned over so fast the undertaker had given up learning names. Gold does that to a place. It draws the ambitious and the desperate in equal measure, and it draws close behind them the kind of men who've learned that the fastest way to get rich off a gold camp is to never dig at all. That was the Vance gang's whole trade. Ezekiel Vance had ridden into Kane's Hollow 2 years back with 4 men and a reputation, and inside of a season he owned the camp the way a tick owns the dog. It's fed on quietly, completely, and in a manner the host mostly didn't notice until the damage was already done. He ran the protection on both saloons. He took a toll on every wagon of supplies that came up the canyon road. He and his men had been caught robbing the stage to Helena twice and charged with it exactly 0 times, on account of the man wearing the sheriff's star in Kane's Hollow being a soft, sweating creature named Amos Pruitt, who had discovered early and permanently that a fat envelope handed across a card table bought a great deal more peace of mind than a badge ever had. Pruitt told himself he was keeping order. What he was actually doing was renting out his conscience by the week. Ezekiel Vance kept close, a handful of men who did his uglier work. There was Coyle Marsh, a mountain of a man with a saber scar dragging one eyebrow permanently upward, who had ridden with a Missouri raiding outfit during the war and never once in the years since found a substitute for the particular pleasure of watching something suffer slow. There was Skinner Fitch, thin and quick-eyed, who did his killing from behind wagons and roof lines because he had learned a long time ago that a fair fight was a fight you could lose. There was Dutch Malone, who carried a bullwhip coiled at his hip, the way another man carries a second pistol, and who had, by his own count, never once needed to draw a gun in this town because the whip did all the talking he required. And there was Dally Vance, Ezekiel's 19-year-old nephew, soft-jawed and eager, the kind of young man who had discovered violence the way some boys discover whiskey, too early, too easily, and Dally liked hurting women best of all. Everyone in Kane's Hollow knew it, and everyone in Kane's Hollow had learned to look away from it. The same reflex that kept them alive kept Dally free. This was not the first public punishment Kane's Hollow had watched the Vance outfit hand out either, which was part of why the crowd that afternoon knew exactly how to arrange itself into silence without a single word passed between them. There had been a freight driver the winter before, beaten half to death in front of the livery for refusing to pay a second toll on the same load of supplies. There had been a claim-jumping dispute settled the previous autumn, with a bonfire built out of a man's own cabin while his family watched from the tree line, his particular crime having been filing his paperwork through the county recorder in Helena. Kane's Hollow had learned its lessons the way any frightened town learns them, not all at once, but one public example at a time, until every soul in that camp understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly what happened to anybody who crossed the outfit running things. That was the whole reason a schoolteacher tied to a hitching post could draw a crowd of 40 people willing to watch and not one willing to step forward. Fear, once it's been taught properly, doesn't need repeating. It just needs an audience every so often to remember the lesson by. Now, 12 years before any of that, a long way south and east of Kane's Hollow, there had been a homestead in a quiet Kansas valley that belonged to a rancher and his young family. He'd married a schoolteacher's daughter named Mara, and together they'd raised 2 boys, Eli and Tom, on a spread of good bottomland that he'd broken himself, one field at a time, with his own 2 hands and a mule he'd bought on credit and paid off early. His younger sister had come to live with them after their parents died of the fever, a girl of 14 named Grace, quiet and clever, who wore a small silver cross on a chain their mother had given her, and who used to sit on the porch rail in the evenings, reading by the last light, while the rancher smoked his pipe and told himself his whole life was finally, after years of hard scrabble, arriving somewhere good. It arrived somewhere else entirely. A gang of raiders came through that valley on an autumn evening, working a cattle-rustling circuit that stretched from the Nations up into Kansas, men who took what they wanted and burned what they couldn't carry. They shot the dog first. They shot Mara on the porch steps, trying to get the boys inside. They set the barn alight and then the house, and, in the smoke and the screaming and the gunfire, 5 of them dragged Grace off her feet, still fighting, still wearing that little silver cross, and rode her off into the dark while her brother lay in the yard with a bullet through his side, unable to stand, unable to do one single thing except watch. By the time neighbors found him 3 days later, half dead from the wound and the grief both, his wife and both his sons were in the ground and his sister was simply gone. The way people went in that country sometimes, into a silence nobody could ever fully explain. He healed, because the body is stubborn that way even when the rest of a man has no interest in healing. And once he could sit a horse again, he sold what was left of the homestead for almost nothing, and started tracking. He learned the raiders' names one at a time over years, in saloons and jailhouses and the backs of freight wagons, trading favors and money, and sometimes blood for each new scrap, Vance. That was the name that kept surfacing over and over, the one thread that never went cold even when every other lead did. He tracked that gang through the Nations, through Colorado, up into Wyoming, always a season behind, always arriving at some burned-out camp or abandoned claim just after they'd moved on, until the trail led him 12 years and half a continent later. The tracking itself taught him a second trade, almost as thoroughly as it consumed the first. He learned to read a saloon the way another man reads a ledger, to know, inside of 10 minutes, which 2 or 3 men at the bar would talk for the price of a bottle, and which ones would go quiet and reach for a gun instead. He learned patience in a way most men never have cause to, the particular, grinding patience of watching a lead go cold in Indian Territory, picking up a fresher one 18 months later in a Colorado mining camp, only to arrive and find the men he wanted had ridden out 3 days before on a tip somebody else's carelessness had handed them. Twice, in those 12 years, he came close enough to end it early. Once outside a cow town in the Nations, he'd had Coyle Marsh dead in his sights across a corral fence and held his fire, because 2 of Marsh's men had a rancher's boy between them as a shield. And by the time the boy was clear, so was Marsh. Once in the Wyoming high country, he tracked half the outfit to a line shack in a blizzard, and lost them anyway, when the storm broke early and scattered fresh snow over every track worth following. Each near miss cost him something he didn't get back. Each one also taught him a little more about exactly what kind of men he was chasing, and exactly how far they were willing to go to keep from being caught. Along the way, he stopped being anybody's neighbor, anybody's friend, anybody's anything. He buried his name along with his family, the way another man might bury a keepsake too painful to look at, and let the road give him whatever name it wanted instead. Some called him the Drifter. Some, once they'd seen him work, called him the Ghost. He wore a black duster gone gray with trail dust, a flat-brimmed hat pulled low enough to shade eyes that had watched entirely too much and forgiven almost none of it, and a single Colt worn on his right hip in a holster gone butter-soft from more practice than any one man should ever need. He rode a tired dun gelding that had carried him further than any horse had a right to go, and he asked directions from exactly nobody, because by now he mostly already knew where he was headed. He never rode straight into a town he'd tracked a lead to, not anymore, not after the early mistakes that had nearly gotten him killed twice in his first 2 years on the trail. He'd learned instead to make camp a mile or 2 out and go in on foot after dark, quiet, unremarkable, spending a day or 2 just watching before he ever let anyone know he'd arrived, who ran the place, who was bought, and who wasn't, where the gang bunked, and how many guns they kept close at hand. Kane's Hollow he'd been watching for the better part of a week from a cold camp up in the timber, working out the shape of Ezekiel Vance's operation the same patient way he'd worked out a dozen others before it, waiting for the right moment to walk in rather than simply riding in blind and hoping his gun arm was fast enough to make up for bad information. He had not planned, that particular morning, to walk into Kane's Hollow at all just yet. He had planned to watch one more day. Some mornings, though, a man's plans don't survive contact with what the world decides to show him, and this was going to be one of those mornings, though he didn't know it yet. As he broke camp and rode down toward the edge of town for what he still believed at the time was one more day of quiet reconnaissance. Josie Calloway knew none of this history when she rode into Kane's Hollow 8 months earlier with a trunk of books and a schoolteacher's certificate from a normal school back in Ohio. She'd come west the way a lot of young women came west in those years, because the war had taken most of the men her own age from the town she'd grown up in, because her parents were both gone and there was nothing left holding her in Ohio but a house she couldn't afford to keep, and because a letter from a mining camp school board offering a real wage for a teacher willing to brave the frontier had struck her, on the particular gray morning she'd received it, as the first genuinely interesting thing that had happened to her in years. She had auburn hair she wore in a braid she was forever losing pins out of, a laugh that came easier than her situation probably warranted, and a small silver cross on a chain at her throat that had belonged to her own mother. The children of Cain's Hollow loved her within a week, which was more than could be said for most of what passed through that camp. She taught in a one-room schoolhouse the mining company had thrown up more as a courtesy than a commitment, and because a teacher's wage in a boom town was never quite enough to live on, she'd taken a second job most afternoons keeping the ledgers at the assay office, weighing and recording the gold dust and nuggets that miners brought in to trade for coin. She was careful with numbers. She was careful with everything, in fact, in the particular way of a woman who had learned young that carelessness cost more than most people could afford. And in 8 months of handling other men's gold, she had never once, by even a grain. Her days had settled into a rhythm she'd come almost to love, in spite of everything Cain's Hollow was and wasn't. Mornings belonged to the schoolhouse, to 20-some children of miners and shopkeepers crowded onto benches built from packing crates, chalk dust and wood smoke, and the particular racket of small voices reciting arithmetic tables slightly out of time with one another. She'd grown especially fond of the Hollis family. Down the gulch, a widowed miner named Otto Hollis, raising 3 girls alone since a fever took his wife the winter before, the eldest of whom, a serious 9-year-old named Ruth, had taken to walking Josie. Josie brought the family bread when she baked extra, and Otto Hollis had taken to leaving a little sack of good coffee on her step every so often, the kind of quiet frontier kindness that asked for nothing and expected nothing back. Almost like somewhere she belonged, rather than somewhere she was simply passing through. Afternoons belonged to the assay office and its ledgers, rows of neat figures in her own careful hand, gold dust weighed and recorded and locked away by men who mostly treated her with the particular respect miners reserve for anybody smart enough to keep their books straight. It was, for 8 months, about as good a life as a woman with no family left anywhere could reasonably expect to build for herself out west. And it made what came next all the crueler for how ordinary and safe those 8 months had felt right up until the moment they weren't. That didn't matter to the Vance gang, of course, because the accusation was never really about the gold. Ezekiel Vance had wanted the assay office's weighing contract funneled through a man of his own choosing, a crooked scale that would let him skim a fraction off every ounce that passed through Cain's Hollow without a single miner the wiser, and Josie, sharp-eyed and honest to the point of stubbornness, had caught the substitute weight the very first week it was tried and reported it plainly to the office manager. Vance did not forgive people who cost him money, and he especially did not forgive a schoolteacher who'd embarrassed him in front of his own nephew, who'd been the one carrying the rigged weight in the first place. Though 3 weeks later, when a pouch of dust went missing from the office safe, under circumstances nobody bothered to investigate too closely, it was Josie Calloway's name that got shouted first and loudest. And it was Josie Calloway they dragged out into the street to answer for it, because in Cain's Hollow, the men who ran the camp didn't need proof. They only needed an audience. The office manager, a nervous, decent-enough man named Whitfield, who owed the mining company his job and Ezekiel Vance his continued good health, had come to her 2 days before it happened and warned her, in a low voice with the office door shut, that Vance had been asking pointed questions about the missing pouch and that her name kept coming up in ways Whitfield didn't much like the sound of. He'd suggested, as gently as a frightened man can suggest anything, that she might consider taking the stage out to Helena for a spell, visiting a cousin, anything that put distance between herself and whatever Ezekiel Vance was building toward. Josie had thanked him and stayed anyway, partly because she had nowhere else in the world with a cousin waiting, and partly because some stubborn part of her, the same part that had reported the rigged scale in the first place rather than simply looking away like everyone else in that camp had learned to do, refused to believe that honesty could really cost a person as much as everyone kept warning her it might. She had spent those 2 nights sleeping poorly, listening to the ordinary sounds of the boarding house and telling herself she was imagining the danger. She had not been imagining it. That afternoon the heat sat heavy over Main Street, thick with wood smoke and the mineral tang that gold camps always seem to carry, dust hanging gold-brown in the slanted light the way it does in high country in late summer. Dally Vance and 2 others had marched Josie out of the assay office by her arms, her protests drowned under Ezekiel's flat, carrying announcement that a thief had been caught stealing from the honest men of Kane's Hollow. They tore the sleeve of her dress, getting her wrists bound. They stripped her down to her shift in front of the whole gathering street, because humiliation was always half the point, and they lashed her wrists to the hitching post outside the Gilded Spur saloon with a length of rope Dutch Malone had already coiled and ready. The way a man readies a tool he's used 100 times before and expects to use 100 more. Sheriff Amos Pruitt had not always been the sort of man who watched things like this happen without lifting a finger. He'd worn the star, honestly enough, his first year in Kane's Hollow, back before the gold camp had grown big enough to attract an outfit like Vance's, back when the worst of his duties involved breaking up drunken brawls between rival claim jumpers. Vance had bought him the way he bought everything else in that town. Slowly, patiently, a favor here and a debt forgiven there, until one evening over cards Vance had simply named a figure, a weekly sum large enough to make a sheriff's modest salary look like a joke. Pruitt had told himself that first week that he'd take the money just until he'd saved enough to leave Kane's Hollow for somewhere quieter. 2 years later he was still telling himself the same story, and the story had stopped being true so long ago that even he had trouble remembering exactly when. The crowd gathered the way. Crowds gather for a hanging, not because they wanted to see it, most of them, but because not watching felt somehow more dangerous than watching did. Miners fresh off shift stood shoulder to shoulder with the boarding house women and the mercantile clerk, and a half-dozen children who'd been herded there by older siblings not quite fast enough to keep them home. Sheriff Amos Pruitt took up his customary post on the porch of the Gilded Spur, a glass of whiskey already sweating in his hand, and watched the whole thing unfold with the particular blankness of a man who has decided in advance not to see what's in front of him. Dutch Malone uncoiled his whip with a showman's flourish, and the first crack of it across Josie's bare back tore a sound out of her that silenced what was left of the street's ordinary noise entirely. Blood welled along the first stripe almost immediately, dark and shocking against her skin, and Josie's knees buckled against the rope holding her upright. The second lash came faster than the first, and the third faster still, Dutch working himself into the particular rhythm men like him find in this kind of work, until by the fourth crack Josie's cries had thinned into something smaller and more terrible. The little silver cross at her throat swinging loose and catching the afternoon light every time her body jerked against the leather. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman had started quietly crying into her own hands. Nobody stepped forward. In Kane's Hollow, stepping forward had a cost nobody in that street was prepared to pay. If you've stayed with this channel through the stories before this one, you already know that a town's silence usually breaks the same way. One writer, arriving at exactly the wrong moment for the men doing the herding. If these stories matter to you, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name right there under the video, and you'll be helping keep them coming. That was when the dun horse turned the corner from the canyon road onto Main Street. Unhurried, its rider sitting the saddle with the loose, economical posture of a man who had covered a great many miles. He drew rein at the edge of the crowd and sat there a long moment, taking in the scene the way a man reads a familiar sentence in a book he'd hoped never to have to finish. The hitching post, the bound wrists, the blood, and catching the light exactly as it had caught it 12 years and 1,000 miles away. A small silver cross swinging against torn skin. He'd seen that cross before. He had spent 12 years learning every detail of it. The particular curve of its arms, the tiny worn place where a thumb had rubbed the silver thin over years of nervous habit, because it was the last thing he'd watched vanish into the smoke. For one long, terrible second, the man on the dun horse believed, with the kind of certainty grief manufactures out of nothing at all, that he was looking at his sister again. Then his eyes cleared, and he understood it was a different woman entirely, a stranger, wearing what could only be the same maker's work, the same pattern, purchased or passed down or simply, cruelly coincidental, and it did not matter one particle which, whatever thin patient thread had been holding him together for 12 years of tracking snapped clean through, and something much older and much colder took its place. He dismounted without hurry. He crossed the street the same way, boots finding the muddy ruts without seeming to look for them, and the crowd parted around him the way water parts around a stone dropped into a current, not because anyone told them to, but because there was something in the set of his shoulders that made standing in his path feel suddenly, physically unwise. Dutch Malone was the first of the gang to notice him, whip still coiled loose in one fist, blood from the last stroke still darkening the leather. Dutch grinned the expression of a man who had never once in his life been made to answer for anything. Well now, look what the trail dragged in. You lost, stranger, or you just tired of breathing? The man on foot said nothing. His eyes had already moved past Dutch, to Josie, to the cross, to the blood, tracking down her spine in thin, dark lines, and something in his stillness carried more weight than any answer could have. He stopped exactly 20 paces out, close enough to be heard, far enough that no man in that street could claim later he hadn't had fair warning. Ezekiel Vance stepped down off the boarding house porch where he'd been watching, thumbs hooked lazily in his belt, the posture of a man supremely confident in the arithmetic of 5 armed men against 1. "You've got something to say, Drifter, or are you just admiring the view?" 2 words came back, low and level, carrying clean down the street, the way a low voice sometimes carries further than a shout ever could. Dally Vance let out a short bark of a laugh, half delight and half disbelief, the sound of a young man who has never once had the world tell him no, and doesn't quite know what to do with it now that it has. "Did this fool just give us an order? Uncle Zeke, can I—" Ezekiel raised one hand, and Dally's pistol, already half drawn, settled reluctantly back into its holster. Vance had not built 2 years of quiet ownership over Kane's Hollow by rushing into things, and something about the stranger's stillness had put a small, cold thread of caution into him that he didn't much care for. He studied the man properly. Now the worn holster, the hand that hung loose and easy near it without a hint of tension, the eyes that hadn't so much as flickered since he'd stopped walking. "You've got a death wish, mister?" Vance said finally. "That's Josie Calloway. She stole from every man in this camp, and in Kane's Hollow, debts get paid in skin. This one's already half settled. You ride on, and I'll let you keep the rest of your life to think it over." The man on foot took one slow step forward, closing the distance by a single stride, no more. Dutch cracked his whip toward the stranger's face, the same showman's flourish he'd used 100 times on men who flinched, expecting the crack alone to do the work fear usually did. This time, nobody flinched. There was a blur of motion too fast for the crowd to properly follow. A single gunshot flat and enormous in the sudden quiet, and the tip of Dutch's whip exploded into scraps of leather 3 feet short of its target. For one full second, nobody in that street moved at all. Then, every gun the Vance outfit owned came up at once, and Kane's Hollow learned, in about the space of 4 heartbeats, exactly what 12 years of purpose does to a man's hands. The street emptied around the gunfight the way water empties from a basin with a hole knocked in it, bystanders throwing themselves flat behind water troughs and porch rails, a mule bolting loose from its post and dragging a length of hitching rail clattering down the boardwalk. Otto Hollis had grabbed his daughter Ruth's collar the instant the first shot cracked and hauled her bodily behind the mercantile's brick chimney, and it was from that narrow cover, along with half the frightened town, that Kane's Hollow watched the thing it would still be talking about a decade later. There was no wasted motion in any of it. The stranger didn't duck, didn't dive, for cover the way a man does when he's not sure of his own hand. He simply turned, fired, turned again, each motion flowing into the next, the way water finds its own level. 12 years of practiced patience arriving all at once in the space of a few seconds, nobody in that street would ever fully be able to describe afterward with the same words twice. The first shot took Skinner Fitch's pistol clean out of his grip before he'd even leveled it, the bullet catching the frame and sending both the gun and 2 fingers spinning into the dust. Skinner went down screaming, clutching a ruined hand to his chest out of the fight before he'd fired a single round of his own. Coyle Marsh, the big scarred one, had already thrown himself sideways behind a hitching rail and fired twice from cover wild shots that chewed splinters out of the boardwalk a yard from where they'd been aimed. The second shot from the stranger's Colt caught him high in the shoulder and spun him hard into the rail. His own pistol clattering away into the mud, the fight gone out of that arm for good. Dutch Malone dropped the ruined whip and clawed for the pistol at his own hip too late. Always too late against a man who had spent 12 years learning that the half-second most people waste on hesitation was the only advantage he needed. Sickly color, even through his own rising panic. Dally fired wild, 3 rounds gone and a spray of noise and smoke that found nothing but empty air, and one unlucky window behind the stranger, his hand shaking so badly by the 3rd shot. The stranger walked forward through the drifting powder smoke without so much as breaking stride unhit, untouched, the particular calm of a man who had already survived the only version of this moment that ever truly frightened him, the one 12 years ago, in a burning Kansas yard. This time he had, both. "Release her," he said again, quieter now, and something about the quiet was worse than the shouting had been. Ezekiel Vance had finally worked out who he was facing. It arrived in his face all at once, the color draining out of it the way water drains from a cracked jug. The black duster, the patient walk, the 12-year patience of a hunt that never once lost the scent. "You," Vance breathed. "You're him, the Kansas ghost. I heard men swear you were dead." "For grace," the man said, and fired once more, shattering the pistol still half raised in Vance's own gun hand, the weapon spinning away into the mud along with two of his fingers. Vance went down, cursing, cradling the ruin of his hand against his chest, the fight and the fear, and 12 years of easy ownership over Kane's Hollow all draining out of him at once in the dirt of his own main street. Only Dally remained standing, trembling, his emptied revolver hanging, forgotten, in one shaking hand, 19 years old and looking for the first time anyone in that crowd had ever seen. The stranger closed the last few steps, then pressed the still warm barrel of the Colt lightly beneath the young man's chin. Not hard, not cruel, just final. Cut her loose, now. Dally's knife shook so badly, it took him 3 tries to saw through the rope. Josie's knees gave the instant her wrists came free, and the stranger caught her before she reached the ground, one arm sweeping under her and pulling her up against him, shrugging the black duster off his own shoulders in the same motion to wrap around her bleeding back. She was barely conscious, her breath coming in small broken pulls, one hand rising weakly to close around the front of his shirt the way a drowning person closes around anything solid. Sheriff Amos Pruitt finally found his legs and came down off the porch, whiskey glass abandoned somewhere behind him, his voice pitched high with a fear that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with his own suddenly precarious position. Now hold on, mister. You just shot 4 of the most dangerous men in the territory. That's a hanging offense in most towns I know. The stranger looked at him with an expression that made the sheriff's next sentence dry up in his throat before he could find it. No, he said. I just released her. What you do with the rest of this town is your own business, same as it's always been. He lifted Josie carefully onto the dun saddle in front of him, settling her against his chest, and turned the horse's head toward the canyon road without another glance at the men bleeding in the street behind him. Ezekiel Vance, propped against the boardwalk with his ruined hand cradled against his ribs, found enough breath and enough hatred to scream after him. You think this ends here? I'll rebuild this outfit twice over, and I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. You hear me? To the ends of the earth. The stranger didn't turn around. His voice carried back over his shoulder, anyway, low and unhurried, the same voice that had started the whole thing 20 minutes earlier. Come, find me. I've been waiting 12 years for somebody to try. The dun horse carried them both out past the last shanty, at the edge of Kane's Hollow, and into the tree line without hurrying, the way its rider never hurried, and the whole gold camp stood in the settling dust of Main Street and understood, all at once, that the particular arrangement of fear it had been living inside for 2 years had just come apart at the seams, in about the time it takes to boil a pot of coffee. It was Otto Hollis who moved first once the shooting stopped, stepping out from behind the mercantile chimney with his daughter still gripping his coat sleeve, calling out that somebody ought to fetch water and clean bandage for the men bleeding in the street, whatever else anybody thought of them, because a decent town didn't leave even its worst men to bleed out in the open. It was in its small way the first thing anybody in Kane's Hollow had done in 2 years that Ezekiel Vance hadn't first approved of, and it seemed to break something loose in the rest of the crowd, too. The mercantile clerk went for bandages, and by the time Sheriff Pruitt had finished making his useless protest to a stranger already riding away, half the street had found its nerve again. All at once, the particular courage that shows up exactly 1 moment too late to matter for the person who needed it most. Kane's Hollow would not look quite the same by the following spring. Within a season, a proper federal marshal had ridden through, following up on the stagecoach robbery, charges nobody had ever managed to make stick. Amos Pruitt had quietly resigned his star rather than answer certain uncomfortable questions, and the town had begun slowly and imperfectly the way these things always do, to remember what it felt like to run itself without paying protection money to do it. Word of what happened on Main Street outran the two of them by nightfall, the way word always does in a camp that size. A peddler carried it to the next gulch over before sundown, and by the following morning it had picked up the kind of embellishment stories always gather in the retelling, growing a second gunslinger here, a burning building there, until half of Montana Territory was arguing over a version of events that bore only a family resemblance to what had actually happened outside the Gilded Spur. What none of the retellings got wrong, though, was the 3 words. Everybody who'd stood in that street that afternoon agreed on those word for word, the way you agree on the one true thing at the center of a story that's otherwise gone soft with retelling. He rode 2 days into the high country before he judged it safe to stop for longer than a few hours' rest, following a game trail up through stands of lodgepole pine into a narrow canyon he'd sheltered in more than once over the years. Place with good water and a rock overhang that broke the wind and hid a fire's glow from anybody riding the valley floor below. He made camp there in the last blue light of the second evening, boiled coffee over a small fire, and spent the better part of an hour cleaning and redressing the wounds on Josie's back with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the hands that had, 2 days before, dismantled 5 armed men without breaking a sweat. She slept most of that first night and half the next day, worn through by blood loss and shock, and the particular exhaustion of surviving something her body hadn't yet finished believing was over. He kept the fire going and kept his distance in the careful, deliberate way of a man unused to close company and unwilling to crowd a woman who'd already had far too many people put their hands on her without permission that week. When she finally woke, fully, on the 3rd afternoon, it was to the smell of coffee and the low, steady sound of a whetstone working along the edge of a knife, and to the sight of the stranger sitting across the small fire from her, cleaning his Colt with the unhurried care of a man performing a ritual rather than a chore. She'd woken twice in the night before that, both times from the same dream. The whip and the rope and the crowd's blank faces replaying themselves in that particular relentless way trauma has of insisting on being felt again before it will finally let a person go. Both times she'd found the stranger already awake across the low coals, not looking at her exactly, but positioned in a way that made it plain he'd heard her stir and had simply been waiting, quiet and patient. He never once asked her to explain the dreams. He never once offered false comfort about how it would all feel better soon. He just stayed close enough that the canyon didn't feel quite so large and quiet and full of shadows, and by the second morning that alone had done more for her than any words could have. The canyon itself had a way of working on a person over those first few days, quieting things down that a busy street or a crowded boarding house never gave a body room to feel properly. Water ran clear and cold over a bed of granite a short walk from the fire, and mornings brought a particular gray-gold light through the lodgepole pines that Josie found herself watching for once she was well enough to sit up and watch anything at all. Elk moved through the upper meadow at dusk most evenings, unbothered by the small fire and the 2 quiet figures beside it, and once a golden eagle worked the thermals along the canyon rim for the better part of an hour while they both sat, wordless attention that does more to knit 2 strangers together than any amount of conversation usually manages. It was, in its own rough way, the gentlest stretch of ground. Either of them had stood on, and longer than either cared to admit, she recovering from a wound the whole town of Cain's Hollow had watched laid open her back. Why? Her voice came out cracked and small, the first real word she'd managed since the canyon. You didn't know me. You'd never even seen me before. He was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps he wasn't going to answer at all, his eyes gone somewhere past the fire, somewhere she couldn't follow. I knew the cross, he said finally. They took her from me 12 years back, and I never got the chance to do one thing about it. Today I got the chance to do something. He turned the Colt over once in his hands, set it aside. Couldn't save her. Figured I could save you. Josie's fingers found the little silver cross at her own throat, closing around it the way she always did when she was working something through, feeling its familiar shape differently now, knowing what it had cost the man across the fire to see it swinging on her chest in the middle of a public street. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it in a way that went further than the word usually reached. About your sister. About all of it. Wasn't your doing. He fed another piece of dead wood into the fire, watched the sparks climb. 12 years I told myself I was hunting Vance's outfit for Grace. Turns out I was hunting them for whoever else they get around to hurting next, and just didn't have a face to put on it yet, till I rode into that street and saw you. He looked at her properly then, for the first time since she'd woken. Something in his expression she hadn't yet learned to read. Guess now I've got one. He meant it, and something about the way he said it made the small fire between them feel a little warmer than it had a moment before. If stories like this one keep you coming back, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name to help keep them coming. They stayed in that canyon camp 4 more days while her back finished its worst healing, the wounds closing to raw pink lines under the salve he mixed from something in his saddlebags, and in those 4 days something passed between them that neither one of them found easy words for, though both of them noticed it happening. She learned he could read slowly and by firelight, from a small worn book of Psalms he never explained and she never asked about. He learned she talked in her sleep sometimes disjointed fragments about her mother's kitchen back in Ohio, and that she hummed without noticing when her hands were busy with some small task like mending or sorting kindling. Neither of them talked much about what came next, because both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that Ezekiel Vance's threat hanging over that Montana gold camp wasn't the kind of thing that simply evaporated because a man rode away from it. There was one bad night in the middle of those 4 days, a night that tested exactly how far that threat still reached. He'd heard riders on the game trail below the canyon a little after midnight, 2 horses moving slow and careful in a way that told him, whoever it was already suspected, which draw he'd chosen. He'd woken Josie without a word, doused the fire, and moved them both up into the rocks above the overhang with his Colt drawn and ready, and they'd spent almost 2 hours in the cold dark listening to the riders search the lower canyon before finally giving it up and turning back the way they'd come. A couple of Vance's remaining hands, most likely. Sent out on a long shot that hadn't paid off, Josie had not been frightened in quite the way she expected to be, crouched in the rocks with the cold coming up through her boots. She'd found herself, instead, simply watching the stranger's face in the thin moonlight, the total stillness of him, and understanding for the first time exactly how a man survives 12 years of a hunt like his. Not through anger, in the end, but through this same patient, unshakable calm, waiting out whatever the night decided to throw at him for as long as it took. On the 5th morning, over the same tin cup of coffee that had become a kind of ritual between them, Josie finally asked the question she'd been circling for days. "You have a name, a real one. Not drifter, not ghost, not whatever they've taken to calling you down in that camp." For a long moment he didn't answer, turning the tin cup slowly in his hands, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, some old weight settling into a different shape than it had held for 12 years. When he finally spoke, it was the first time in longer than he could clearly remember that the word had left his mouth out loud. "Rourke," he said. "Buried it with the rest of them 12 years back. Figured a dead man didn't need a name anymore." He looked up at her across the thin blue smoke of the morning fire, something almost like the ghost of a smile finding the corner of his mouth for the first time since she'd known him. "Reckon I might need it again." "Then thank you, Rourke," she said, and reached across the fire to close her hand briefly over his scarred one, "for giving me my life back. And it looks to me like you gave yourself a piece of yours back, too, whether you meant to or not." He didn't pull his hand away. They talked longer that fifth evening than they had all the days before it combined, the particular ease that sometimes settles between two people once the hardest question between them has finally been asked and answered. She told him about the classroom back in Ohio where she'd first trained, about a mother who died believing her daughter would marry a local farmer and never leave the county, about the strange, frightening freedom of a letter that had offered her a wage and a schoolhouse 1,000 miles from anyone who'd ever known her before. He told her in pieces about Eli and Tom, about a mule he'd bought on credit and paid off early, about small, ordinary things from a life that had ended so completely 12 years back that he'd almost forgotten those details had ever belonged to a real person rather than a story he told himself in the dark. Neither one of them said anything that night about what might come after the canyon, about Kane's Hollow or Ezekiel Vance, or where either of them was meant to go, once her back had healed enough to ride. Some conversations, they both seemed to understand without saying so, are better left for daylight, when a person's got the strength to actually mean what they decide. They rode down out of the high country together 3 days later, not toward Kane's Hollow, where a broken and humiliated Ezekiel Vance was already, by every account that reached them, rebuilding his outfit and swearing vengeance to anyone who'd listen, but toward a smaller settlement 2 valleys over where a woman with a schoolteacher's certificate and no history anyone there had ever heard of could quietly start again, and where a man who'd finally remembered his own name could decide for the first time in 12 years what he wanted to do with the rest of it. Some folks who'd passed through that country afterward swore the 2 of them settled a modest place along a creek and never went looking for trouble again. Others swore they'd seen a lone rider on a dun horse, sometimes with a woman beside him and sometimes without, still working the trails between one gold camp and the next, the way a man does when a debt that size teaches him he could never quite stop listening for the next person who might need those same 3 words spoken on their behalf. Ezekiel Vance never did rebuild his outfit the way he'd screamed he would in the dust of Kane's Hollow's Main Street. A man missing 2 fingers off his gun hand finds the trade a good deal harder than it used to be, and a man whose whole camp has just watched him broken by a single rider finds it harder still to convince anyone worth having. Coyle Marsh drifted south within the year, his shoulder never quite right again. Skinner Fitch left the territory entirely rather than risk being recognized by a federal marshal who'd started asking around about that stagecoach business. Dally Vance, of all of them, seemed the most changed by that afternoon. Folks who saw him afterward said the swagger had gone out of him for good, that he took work at a livery in a town 200 miles east under a name that wasn't his own and never touched a gun again that anyone ever heard of. Whatever kingdom Ezekiel Vance had built in 2 years of quiet fear came apart in considerably less time than that, the way most kingdoms built on nothing sturdier than everyone else's silence tend to do once the silence finally breaks. What's certain, and what every soul who stood on that Cain's Hollow Street that afternoon still tells the same way, no matter how many years pass between the telling, is this: when the whip fell silent and the crowd held its breath, and Ezekiel Vance's whole rotten kingdom stood there daring the world to look away. One man rode in out of 12 years of grief and said, the only thing that ever needed saying, release her. And Cain's Hollow learned the hard way that justice in that country didn't always wear a badge, and it didn't always come quickly, but when it finally arrived, it came complete, and it came for good. If you want more frontier justice stories like this one, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. Thank you for riding this one out to the end with me, and I'll see you on the next trail.